Okay, so we're going to study about terms today. And for a term, there are four parts. You have the sign, then you have where the number goes, which is called a constant or a coefficient. So that's how we're going to refer to them. And I'll explain what the difference is between a constant and a coefficient later. Then you have the variable, which is usually represented in math as a letter. And then for each constant and coefficient, or for each variable, you have an exponent, okay? So here's an example right here. The sign is negative. Here, this is a coefficient, so it's a 4. The 4 is the coefficient, and the x is the variable. And then the exponents go up here. They're smaller numbers, and they go up in the top right-hand corner. So this 2 belongs to the 4. And this exponent, the 3, belongs to the variable, which is the x, okay? So what are the only two things that a sign can be? A sign is either positive or negative, okay? So if you're asking what's the sign, it's only going to be one of these two things. Now, here's a question, when is a sign invisible? So when you're looking at a term, when would a sign be invisible? The answer is when it's a positive, okay? So for example, here you see this as a 4. And if I asked you, is this 4 positive or is it negative? You'd say positive because there is no sign in front of it. So technically, there is a plus sign here, but it's invisible, okay? So whenever we see a 4 or we see a number, a constant or a coefficient, and there's nothing in front of it, we just know that there's an invisible plus there, okay? An invisible positive. So the four parts of a term, the sign goes here. It's either going to be a negative sign or there's not going to be anything there because it's a positive, and the positive is invisible. The next part, what is a constant or a coefficient? It is a number. That's where the number goes. It can be a natural number, a whole number, an integer, or even a rational number. A coefficient is a number that has a variable after it, okay? So this 2, we're going to call a coefficient because it's got a variable, which in this case is x. A constant does not have a variable, okay? There's no variable here, so we're going to refer to this as a constant. Okay, so whenever I'm saying a coefficient or a constant, we're talking about the number, but we use a different term depending on whether we're talking about a term with a variable or one that's not. So coefficient equals, there's a variable. Constant, which is a little easier to remember, smaller word, does not have a variable, okay? Constant because this stays the same. Next, when is the coefficient invisible? Okay, remember coefficient has a variable in it, has a variable. So when is the coefficient invisible? When two things happen. When it's in front of the variable, which that's what makes it a coefficient, and when it's 1. So when a coefficient is 1, then it's invisible. Let's look at the example here. When we have x is really the same thing as writing 1x, because we really only have 1x. But we don't have to write the 1x, so in order to save time, we just write x. So 1x is the same thing as just writing x, so we're just going to write x. That means there's an invisible 1 here, okay? So if I ask you, what is the coefficient to x? And again, coefficient is the number. What number is here? What coefficient is it? It's 1. If there's nothing there, then you know it's an invisible 1. Now, when is a constant invisible? And remember, constant is a number that doesn't have a variable after it. So when is a constant invisible? Never. There's never, if there is no variable and no number, then there's just no number there. There's nothing there, okay? So a constant is never invisible, but a coefficient is if it's a 1. Okay. So the coefficient or the constant would go right here. If there's a variable, then it's going to be a coefficient. And if there's no variable, then we're going to refer to this as a number. So, what is a variable? If you haven't looked at this before, variables are usually represented by letters. So, and what that letter represents, what the variable represents, is something that we don't know yet. That variable could be any number, rational, whole number, integer, whatever. It could represent any number. And when we're writing a variable in math, we're always going to write it as a letter. Well, not always, we're almost always going to write it as a letter, but we're never going to write it as a number. So if you see a number and no letter, then there is no variable there. If you see a letter, that letter is never going to be a number, and a number is never going to be a letter, okay? Or a number is never going to be a variable. So when is a variable invisible? Okay, so when is a variable going to be invisible? There's a question, and the answer is never. It will never be a variable, or it will never be invisible. If you don't see a variable there, then there is no variable in the term, okay? So what is an exponent? An exponent is the number, is a smaller number up in the top right-hand corner. You can see it right here. And what that exponent tells us is how many times we're going to multiply the number or the variable by itself. So when you have 4 to the second power, or 4 squared, you can call it either way, what that means is you got 4 times 4. And you're only doing it twice because there's a 2 there, so 4 times 4. Or here you got 5 to the third power, which means you're going to multiply 5 by itself 3 times. So that would be 5 times 5 times 5. Okay? So when is the exponent invisible? The exponent is invisible when it's a 1. Okay? And the reason for that is because, again, the exponent tells us how many times we're going to multiply it against itself. Well, here, it's only 1, so 4 to the first power is the same thing as just saying 4. So there's no need to write the 1 there, because again, we want to save time. So let's recap. What 3 things can be invisible in a term? What 3 things? The sign. When the sign is positive, then it's invisible. When the exponent is a 1, it's invisible. And when the coefficient, and again, remember, coefficient is when there's a variable next to it. So it's the number when there's a variable next to it. When the coefficient is a 1, then it's invisible because it's in front of the variable. So what are the 2 things that are never, ever invisible? Well, it's the constant, which is the number that does not have a variable after it. So that's never invisible. And variables. If you don't see the variable there, it's not invisible. It's just not there. There is no variable. Okay? So now go play quizzes and let's test your knowledge of what you just learned.